Hello everyone, and welcome to the 11th round of the FIDE candidates. Today I'll be doing a recap of all the games that went on with some interesting stories to tell. My name is Jessie February, and let's jump right in. The first game was Alireza versus Jan Nepomniachtchi, and the discussion of this game begins about 14 hours before it even began. Alireza logged on to Lichess and began playing 30-second hyperbullet games versus Grandmaster Daniel Narodetsky, who was also in Madrid for the commentary. The match continued for about 5 hours, with Narodetsky beating Alireza 142 points to 108. It was also discovered that all of this went down at 5 o'clock in the morning. So in this game, with Alireza playing e4 in the first move, we have the Petrov. And what we found out by watching the games that Alireza played against Narodetsky, all of his first moves were d4. So of course he wasn't aiming on showing off any of his preparation for this game after d3, knight f6 and d4, looking like a very solid center for white. Black just plays bishop e7. So one of the options in this position is that black doesn't play d6 to d5 and waits for white's move. So d5 by white, and black plays knight to e5, knight d4 and castles. Knight to c3, bishop to g4, and f3. So the idea of keeping more pieces on the board is understandable. However, the move blocks the knight on the d4 square. It makes it vulnerable, preventing knight d4 to f3 ideas in the future. Bishop d7 by black, queen e2, so it was really nice to provoke f3 by black here and bringing the bishop back to d7, and c6. Attacking the pawn chain, starting the pressure in the center. Castles, c takes d5, c takes d5, and queen b6 by black, just putting pressure on this diagonal, especially with the knight only having one defender and the king being behind. Not the best place for the queen, it seems, in this position, as it blocks the black dark squared bishop from the placement on the b6 square. However, after king h1, rook c8, and g4, the start of an incorrect plan. Problem is that the attack with the pawns on the king side performed by white also weakens the white king. After h6, h4, we saw something really similar with Hikaru Nakamura versus Alireza, with a very weak kingside rook, f to e8 and g5. After h takes and knight to h5, there's already no discussion about white's attack, but black starts to create threats on the white king. The threat of knight g3 is overwhelming. After king to g2, knight to g6, black starts to take advantage of all the weak squares around the king. So white is pretty much forced to play f4, but here black simply takes with the h-knight using the hanging position of white's pieces and the open position of the white king. Nepomniachtchi sacrifices the knight for white pawns and grabs the pawn on b2, knight to e4 because it was under attack, and beautiful move. Rook to c4. Although here it was considered by the engine and our annotator as a slight inaccuracy, and rather bishop d8 was a better move, trying to bring the bishop around to the b6 square eventually, and of course just putting pressure with the rook on e4. So after rook c4, bishop e3, capturing on g5, and it really looks like all of black's pieces are hanging. But it is impossible to take the bishop due to rook takes e3, and you cannot move the bishop on e2 due to the queen pinning the bishop to the king. And after rook b1, queen takes a2, maintaining that pin, and rook takes d4 here. So rook takes queen, bishop takes queen, and bishop takes e3. And even though white is up the exchange, white is also down for pawns. After knight takes d6, rook to e7 and bishop to b3, bishop c5 putting pressure on the knight, knight takes b7, bishop e6, and bishop to c4 here. So the white king is extremely weak, so rook to e3, king h1, bishop h3, piling more pressure on the king here, and now preparing bishop to e4, bishop f1, stopping this, but sadly it is not enough, since after bishop to g2 there is rook to h3, checkmate. The second game was sponsored by Hikaru Nakamura versus Richard Rapport. And the first big surprise arrived on move 1, a Sicilian. We almost assumed that they had abolished that opening with the frequency at which it is being played in this event. So we see a Sicilian, so many S's, oh my goodness. And after a few moves we realize that is the Sveshnikov. It has taken me ages to learn how to pronounce that word, and I'm pretty sure that I'm still not nailing it. Sveshnikov. Shifneshnikov. B5, knight to d5, and we just have regular theory here. A line that I've often had to take a look at as a chess player. And after bishop to e6, knight takes knight on e7. The novelty that also doesn't change the evaluation of the position. Queen takes and knight to f5. Queen back to d8, and black is not willing to give up the bishop here. Queen takes d6, and after g6, just exchanging queens. Although the extra pawn does not mean anything after the queens have been traded, things are completely equal, and black recaptures the pawn on b3, bishop a2, rook b2, and black still has the bishop pair until they are traded off. Knight versus bishop, beautiful move by black, rook to b5, threatening h7 to h5, rook takes b4, rook takes, and bishop takes, taking on g6, and here we just have a completely equal endgame that went on for a few more moves, which we are going to zoom past. I hope that's okay. You've never seen minor pieces move so fast at the speed of light. And the game still continues for a couple hundreds of moves. But you know, nothing will beat the long game that Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi had played last year during the World Championship match. And the game ends after 96 moves. And the third game was between Fabiano Caruana and Ding Liren. Ding playing exquisite chess, coming back in the second half of the tournament, but I'm not going to give away too much about the result of this game. So let the proof be in the pudding. Let's take a look at the beautiful moves that were played. e4, e5, and we have a Spanish, and after bishop e7, rook e1, and a4 by white. Bishop e7, d3, after knight e2, knight g3, very nice maneuver of the knight to the king side, and after bishop to g6, we see a series of very interesting moves here. So bishop d8 was being played, and after knight to g7, however, rook e7 keeps the knight on f6 square, undefended unfortunately. So after h3 by white, keeping the tension of the position rather stressful for black, black plays b3, sacrificing the pawn. Of course, you want to eliminate the bishop from having any pressure on this diagonal, at least temporarily, and bishop takes. So Ding decides to exclude the like-squared bishop from the game and destroy the pawn structure in turn. And after bishop c6, rook to c1, king h8 by black here, and knight to e6 with a hanging rook. What is a tactic between friends? And now white is simply an exchange up. However, black gets it back by attacking. Black gets it back by having a discovered attack on the bishop, and bishop takes e1, and here rook takes b3. Queen to a5, knight to g8, bishop e3, and bishop to b7, protecting the a-pawn but also stopping white from creating a passed pawn of their own. However, it allows white to regroup their pieces quite well here, and white plays queen d2, f6, and f4. E takes f4. A conceptual error opening the position makes white's task of attacking to the rival king easier. So here bishop takes and g5, very interesting. Bishop e3, queen to e5, putting pressure on the knight, knight to f5, knight e7, white gladly trades over there, and queen to c2, pushing the rook back and preparing the bishop to d2 and c3 later on, attacking the diagonal towards the king after rook to b6, we have rook f1, king g7, defending that pawn on f6, also bringing the king closer towards the center, and a5 attacking the rook, rook to c6, and bishop d2 here, and allows black to regroup its rook, rook to c8, and bishop to c3, now officially putting immense pressure on this pawn. Rook f8 seems to be the only move, and queen to f2, putting even more pressure on that pawn. And after h4, bishop to c8, and b4 by white. Bishop d7, played by black, creates an additional weakness on the c5 square here, capturing, and now the pressure is on c5. Rook to b1, possibly preparing rook b7, rook to the 7th rank. However, allows black to activate the bishop, bishop to b5, stopping the rook's entry. And after exchanging on the g file, king to g8, losing the remaining part of the small advantage, and we have d4, bishop to d3, rook to e1, and capturing on d4, queen h7, offering a trade of queens, but white declines ever so politely. And after e5, queen to d7, attacking the bishop, but also attacking the bishop with check if he does manage to capture. And after bishop to c5, we have rook to c8, queen check, queen to f7 covers, and here e6. Pushing the pawn, but the pawn is easily blocked here with queen to c7, and after e7, king g7, and still no promotion since the bishop is defending and the rook, and queen is attacking on c5 with check, bishop to d4, simply moving back, and the queen enters the king side. After bishop to e3, it's difficult to transform the play for a victory to the play for the equalization here. So after queen to g3, there's queen b4, defending the pawn, but rook to a8. Now black is attacking. Here, after activating the rook, white simply promotes, and after the check on h2, the rook captures, and queen to g4. And this apparently gives black complete initiative. And now queen to e5, white must fight for equality. Queen to d4, offering a trade. Black now says no by playing queen f5, king g1, king g6, and queen to d2, consolidating. And after bishop to c6 here, bishop f2, offering a trade of rooks, and white gives a small check, bishop covers, queen to g3, and we have a trade. And it has transformed to an endgame with an extra pawn for black. Black should try to break somehow. If black manages to create another weakness besides an extra pawn, then perhaps black can win. Only trading the pawns on the king side is not enough, unfortunately. White can draw if black has an extra bishop without the rooks on the board. Since the black bishop's color is the opposite of the promotion square here of the flank pawn on a1. So after f5, bishop c7, king h5, king f2, king g4, rook c1, and rook to c3, possibly cutting off the rook. However, it was considered an error, showing how difficult for humans it is to defend a worse position without any counterplay for a long period of time. And after rook to d7, there's g3, bishop d3, bishop b8, and bishop b5, bringing the bishop back here. The blunder, however, was overloading the rook completely. And after bishop to d8, there's rook e2, king g1, rook d2 attacking the bishop. And after the bishop moves, there's bishop to d3, blocking the defense of the pawn by the rook. And here, unfortunately, white loses the g3 pawn and the game. Fabiano resigned. And the fourth and final game was between Teimour Radjabov and Jan-Christophe Duka. The competitive perfection of the double round-robin format can be easily overrated. And this game is a prime example. If you put two grandmasters in a competitive situation where they both need to win, you are likely to see a very interesting game. If you put them in a situation where neither one will see much of a point in fighting for a win, they will dutifully conserve their energies for a moment where they do. So let's take a look at this very smooth game that was played between the two, and we have in English. So the one thing that we can consider action in this game is definitely the exchanges that take place. So first of all, the bishops on the long diagonal, then by move 15, the queens, and later on we find some pawns the last pair of minor pieces, some rooks, and of course, a repetition by move 33.